So we laid a lot of grounds for thought and discussions. There are legal aspects, engineering aspects, ethics aspects, and many other. In terms of analysis, I think we can kind of divide accountability concept into, say, two stages. First, trying to understand or interpret what machine thinks or how machine makes its decision. And then secondly, how to impose accountability or sometimes legal liability. And about understanding how it works. We talk about complexity, lack of transparency, and many others. And there are a few flavors in that kind of line of argument, and sometimes it's just lack of relevant information. I mean, machine itself may have enough of information, but in the form that it cannot show to human being. Or sometimes there are complex systems or interactions among complex systems, and it's hard to understand from a human viewpoint. Or it could be that sort of modus operandi of human being is very much different from the modus operandi of AI. And there could be some more. And I think we are right now at the stage where, as human beings, you're not even sure what kind of transparency you're talking about. And we need to, say, categorize and put that kind of items into context. And then we can perhaps discuss more seriously about accountability and how to impose accountability in what kind of context. And, with that general observation, I think we can make some discussions among panel members and give you a reaction or thought from other panel members' discussions. Anyone who would want to go first?
So I think one of the things that it could be useful to try to understand is in thinking about the presentation you just made about how do we, when we say fairness or equality, sort of how do we interpret that? One of the things that I just want to throw out there that we're going to probably have to do is start thinking about ranking values, which is incredibly uncomfortable, but one of the things that that I've gotten into in some of my other work with privacy and security, thinking about warnings and thinking about the limitations that people have in understanding certain kinds of disclosures. So we talk a lot about understanding or interpreting the results of AI. People only have enough bandwidth for a certain level of disclosure. And if we want that to count, then we're actually going to need to think about prioritizing which disclosures should come first. And that's going to require a very uncomfortable conversation about what we value the most. Because there are lots of sort of general values like equality and fairness and sort of many conceptualizations of that. And so I only throw that out there as saying it might be time to actually have that conversation because we have to hard code it into technology.
I've heard in a number of events I've been to like this, sort of this latent expectation that if we just talk to each other enough, we're going to, I'm not saying this is what you were saying, just something that came to mind. This expectation that if we all just talk to each other enough that we'll somehow come to consensus on what actually matters. and we'll have this sort of universal set of values that can then be hard-coded into AI or machine learning, and essentially we've done it, we've solved it. In philosophy, we've been working on that for way too long, and we have not come to a consensus. So if we're waiting for that to happen for sort of effective AI governance, I think we're waiting for the wrong thing. And I'm actually very worried about the prospect of essentially coding in a certain notion of fairness simply because it's easily measurable, right? Easily quantifiable, as opposed to something that has come out of the democratic processes or the discursive processes we have in place to decide what actually matters in a particular context.
Okay. One thing in response on that. So I actually totally agree with you, and I didn't mean to come across as saying that. We're going to have to decide one way or the other, because not deciding is also deciding, right? And I don't mean to say that it's right. I simply mean to say that we will always just keep talking about it and never sort of deciding unless we start to push something, talk about it, and actually push something forward.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to put words in your mouth. I suppose so if we're looking for sort of recommendations from this, I'd say what needs to be embedded in, let's say, the design process where you're actually deciding, say, what version of fairness to put into a model or what thresholds to put into is reflexivity, is granularity. It's essentially, ethics is very hard because you have to keep doing it and you have to keep checking and making sure that you're doing it properly. And you have to sort of keep doing it for each case that comes along. So thinking of this as something where we just find the solution, we program it in, or we code it in, and then we're done with it. That's the risk, for sure.
Well, granularity is a very important word, I think. But do you want to add something?
No, I just got listening to that conversation. I think several people have mentioned AI is not one thing; it's 1,000 different applications, right? So what the priorities are, what's fairness, probably is different in each one of those. So I'm not quite sure what the general property would be, or if it's you develop policies for each application as it comes along. I'm not quite sure how you would go about that.
My personal view is, for example, in your keynote speech, you gave several examples or several types of machine learning, and
Right.
For instance, deep learning that's very, non-transparent, or compared to, for example, decision tree model, that's very transparent. If there is a real requirement for a transparent model, perhaps you use more decision tree or something, along the line. If you don't really need explainability, then using deep learning is just fine. And I presume that depending on decision context or types of decisions, perhaps different models should be employed, and different levels of explanations should be given, perhaps. And then, obviously there is a component of fairness, equality, or how granular you treat different groups or subgroups in your data. We sometimes need to manage our own expectations, and the accountability obviously is something very important, and which will even become more important in the near future. But given time constraint, I think we need to give some opportunity to the audience to give, to raise questions.
Thank you very much for very informative and helpful discussions. And my name is B.B. Kim. I'm a professor at KAIST. And I have a question to Mr. Lucchi or Mr. Cunning. The way that we are discussing about the explainable AI is, I think, a little bit misplaced in a way that, the AI industries, they're trying to develop AI in a very innovative ways, but regulators, we want to impose some restrictions well, the AI technology must be in some way explainable. But in reality, I think we have to see the field in a little bit different way. Well, so if you think that you are a person in charge of procuring the AI solutions, and there are multiple types of AI solutions from different companies, then some AI solutions provide functionality of explainability, and some others does not provide it. Then which products would you choose? Obviously, the product with the explainable functionality will be the choice, right? And suppose that you are in a field that you have some accountability obligation to someone else. Suppose that you're a doctor, you must use AI that have the functionality. Because you cannot say to your patient that, oh, my AI solution says this, so I'm giving you this pill. You cannot say that. So if you are a company developing some AI solutions for doctors, then you must adopt the functionality of explainability. So the point that I want to make is that explainability is not a matter of regulation, but it's a key feature that must be required, and that AI solution will surely try to accompany and achieve it. So my question is, so how is the level of the AI solution company's attitude, or the level of the merchantability or productability of the accountability of AI solutions? That's my question. Thank you.
What we see all the time talking to people is certain users just won't use the system if it's not explainable, right? Like doctors, certain military users at DoD, if they don't get an explanation, they just won't turn it on. So that is obviously an economic incentive there. Although now you have a lot of companies, not Google, putting an explainability stamp on their product, and who knows if it's a good explanation. I think that might come along as well.
Professor Felton, do you want to add any comment?
I think we've had a very interesting discussion of explainability, and I feel that there's need for more experience with explainability systems in order to understand what works and what meets the needs of users. And the question of whether such systems will focus, and I'd like to hear the opinion of the panelists on this, whether future explainability systems will focus on designing a system in order to produce a simpler explanation, or whether they will focus instead on constructing explanations around more complex underlying systems. Does that make sense? Do we get to the goal of better explainability by simplifying the underlying models without sacrificing accuracy, or do we get there by improving our ability to generate explanation?
Very interesting question, and personally I'm surprised because that's exactly what I had in mind as a puzzle, whether to make it simplistic or let it become as complex as possible. And it's very interesting because you're an engineer and I'm a lawyer, and we have
So I don't try to generate an explanation of people use these often enough. They'll develop some kind of model. In some cases, that'll work. To answer your other, like we have people on the program pursuing both those approaches you described, right? Changing the model, or just leave the model as it is and see if you can generate a good explanation.
This is a little bit like some of the privacy debates that we're having as well with respect to informing people to get their consent. So on one hand, there's this requirement that you detail all the possible risks, and you lay it out sort of point by point, and there's the more is better because we have more, and then on the other hand, they want it to be very concise. And so you run into the abstraction problem where it's so abstracted it's meaningless. And I haven't figured that one out either, but I think that as those two areas develop, there could be some learning on both sides.
Hesitating because I thought my question might be irrelevant, but Is there no other question? I'm a philosopher of science. I'm teaching philosophy of science, and I have some experience with the Korean chapter of robot ethics 9 years ago about, and we had a problem with the basic concepts such as robot or robot beings, and therefore for me the conceptual problems are essential. And my question is, we were talking about explainable AI, and explainability sounds at first very natural, but it's now grows stranger and stranger a moment, because in Brent Mittelstadt use much philosophy, and what is explanation? A standard definition of explanation or scientific explanation is a answer for a why question. It's what's the sound? And for explainable AI, there is no concrete why question, but we still demand some explainability. And for me, there is no concrete why question yet, but still we demand explainability. It sounds like an idealized concept, and in that sense, almost vacant, if I may dare to say in that way. Could somebody defend the explainability, the notion of explainability from my question? Without concrete why question, there is no such thing like explanability, from philosophical viewpoint at least.
I'd be interested actually to hear if there's a why question behind the DARPA XAI project, because in my case the why question is coming from the person requesting the explanation. So it will be a very specific why question. Why did this thing that I expected to happen not happen, or it could have happened not happened?
You have a user with a particular use case, you know, he's trying to make a decision, he's asking questions to help him do that job. So we don't have a general definition for all situations, right? I think it has to be grounded in a specific situation.
Where I'm coming from, the why is to help allocate responsibility and faults when things go wrong. So if someone gets hurt or someone gets injured, it helps, explainability will help sort of allocate, reverse engineer a lot of decision-making processes in areas, things that were missed or things that were covered, perhaps, in order to help allocate fault appropriately.
Yes, I think there are two important reasons for us to require the explainability of AI. I think the first is that when the AI is explainable, we can make it sure that AI is safe. And the second reason is that, just as mentioned by Professor, is that when AI caused harm to human or cause the loss of property, we can, if the AI is explainable, it will help us to allocate the legal responsibility.
Just one final thing. So to return to your question, I think it's actually a very, very good question that the field I'm referring to, people working on interpretability in general, haven't dealt with in a particularly explicit way. I think there's usually some assumption behind the methods being developed of why it would be useful. I think a lot of them, one of the things I was trying to get across is I think a lot of the methods are seen as these sorts of toolkits that allow you to then start asking why questions. So if you somehow make the model more comprehensible to a person, more human interpretable somehow, whatever that may mean, then that gets you to the point where you can start to ask questions. But I think there is a lot that has not been explicitly stated by the field that I wondered the same thing quite often when reading works on interpretability in particular.
Okay, I see two hands. Professor Lin and Professor Han were there, and I think to save the time, we'll hear questions together, and the panel members will give answers together, perhaps.
I'm mindful of the time, so but I did want to make perhaps even just a comment to throw out. When we talk about accountability and explainability, we're talking about AI, but I think at one point we're going to have to talk about the role of human beings. Not because they're better or maybe they're safer, but just because they're more acceptable, as maybe Jake alluded to. So I was wondering, so for example, in terms of accountability, are we going to be fine with a human being having a kill switch or overseeing, and I was actually very curious as to, in your research, David, with DARPA, what role do you or your teams envision the human being playing? Is it just a design? Is it going to be overseeing? Are you going to have human beings approve this or not? Or is it just going to be a kill switch? I mean, I thought that's very important. It's not only just because we need to apportion liability, but at the same time, if AI really will become accepted by society, I think people not only want the AI to be explainable, but also the role of human beings and what it is going to be also explainable as well. So that was, maybe that's another topic for the next seminar, but I think it's really important. I think we do have to think about that going ahead.
Of course, in all of our situations, we're looking at an AI-human team, right? The person is sort of managing this tool. You know, sometimes he's just getting recommendations, other times he might be operating a system, right? So the human is really in charge, and often they're making the decision or performing the job, but they're getting advice from AI. Now, and we haven't really looked at accountability so much as just thinking if you had better explanations, that would contribute to accountability, but not looking at that directly. Although it reminded me, when we started the program, we had an intel analyst from the U.S. intelligence agencies actually motivated the program, said, you know, here she is sitting at her desk, she had even then big data analytic routines giving her recommendations, but she has to put her name on the recommendation that goes forward. And if it's a mistake, she's blamed, not the AI, right? And so, you know, she's hoping that the explanation would help her justify her decision. But I think it gets at this, especially if you have an AI-human team, who's accountable? How do you distribute that? It's a good question.
I'll make my question simple. Well, everybody understands accountability is important, but if we have two sets of AIs, one with accountability and one without the accountability, and if the latter makes more money, and if the fundraiser or a investment bank uses the latter instead of the former, then how can we ask the investment bank to use the set with accountability? If we impose such kind of regulation, wouldn't it be against the Constitution, against the freedom of economic choice and freedom of contract?
In this case, I think in this case, the government should prohibit this kind of company from growing up. For example, in the case of the killer robot, I think killer robot can make money, can make large amount of money, but it's not accountable because it will cause harm to our humankind. So in this case, I think the government should put a prohibition on producing this kind of AI. So my opinion is that accountability is a precondition of developing an AI system. So we cannot tolerate that an unaccountable AI system be developed, unless in a rule of law state. Thank you.
And there, there may be several ways of going about it with rules. I agree that the government probably has a role to play there, but you could create rules mandating accountability, or you could create liability rules that said that if someone uses a piece of AI that isn't explainable or transparent or something, then the risk of loss is on them. And any harm they create, they're responsible for. So there are several ways you could allocate that. And to Professor Lim's earlier question, I just wanted to briefly return to it. There's a really excellent paper written by a scholar named Malcolm Ellis, who presented it at the We Robot conference a few years ago, that asked this precise question about what is the role of humans within an AI system. And she likens the role of humans within AI systems sometimes to what she called a moral crumple zone, which is the way that cars are sometimes built. They get into accidents, and cars, there are certain parts of cars that are meant to be destroyed and crumple, and humans sometimes are used in that way as an AI system. So in other words, we offload all the moral responsibility onto the human. And in some instances that's fair, and in some instances maybe it's not. And it's a very interesting way to think about the role of humans within AI systems.
Duran, you're fine?
Yeah, sure. Just, I suppose, one thing...
Final comment, maybe?
Yeah, so one thing that came to mind with the last question is sort of the increasing marketability of transparency or accountability or fairness, or all these words that you can sort of attach to different models. I've heard the idea proposed that we might have a market of models, essentially, where different companies are offering the same service, and maybe the ones that are more explainable will attract more customers. So I suppose there's a market-based answer to it. I don't know if I fully buy into it, and I do worry about certification standards that sort of attach a label to a model or to a system at the point that they're being designed or trained, or when they're still tested in-house, and then before they're sold off or released into the wild, so to speak, when they can behave very differently. I've heard of a proposal for fairness certification, for example, that will say that a particular model is shown to be fair. So I think we'll see more firms pushing towards explainability if it's perceived as having market value. But I do worry that that could be sort of dumbed down version of explainability.
Okay, well, perhaps there are many more questions, but just because we don't have time, I'm sorry, right there. I personally learned a lot, and I think we at least agreed that accountability is very important. And secondly, there are so many issues out there. We are in a very, very initial, early stage of understanding what the issues are. We're not just beginning to delineate and beginning to make the questions more concrete. So there is a long road that we'll have to go through and find our own solutions. So I think it's a very important initial step that we are taking today, and we'll continue to come back and discuss. Thank you all. Thank you for the panel members and others for patience. Thank you.